Welcome to Firsts in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write fantastic fiction. I'm your host, Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain, the Hand of Adonai series, and Firsts in Fiction.
And I'm Alton Gansky, coming to you from my secret lair deep beneath the farmland of Central California. I'm the author of Wounds, and most recently The Village, and a bunch of nonfiction and a whole bunch of novels, two of which are good.
Sorry, didn't mean to step on you there. I'm Molly Jo Riley, producer of the podcast. I think you have a few more books than just two that are good. Maybe like 3.5. You got to stop cutting yourself down like that.
I feel so much better now.
I do what I can. I'm producer
3 for 45.
Podcast, author of the Unemployment Cookbook, and current work in project NOLA.
I'm just curious which half is good, or is it just like a quarter of this book and a quarter of another book, or?
I go for the compilation theory.
All right, we got it.
Pull a sentence here, a paragraph there.
Well, when you've written 40 books, all you have to have is like 60 good pages in each, and you got a good book, right?
There you go.
All right.
I wouldn't know.
A reminder to those of you listening to the audio-only podcast, you can watch us live on Google Hangouts, 6:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. You can add us, firstsinfictionpodcast@gmail.com, and you'll get our invites to the show. It's also on YouTube, I'm sure, and you could probably figure out how to view that live if you're tech savvy. Unlike me, I'm good just to be awake right now and doing the podcast. So, hooray for that! So our Ask the Author question tonight comes from Jessie Bailey Anderson, fellow LPC author, fellow Brimstone author, and she asks, I feel a little bit, first of all, like she might be taking advantage of the opportunity by asking almost 4 questions in one, but they're all somewhat related. So she says, what do you do when you aren't writing? Are you a night writer or a day writer? I like to think of myself as a night writer, R-I-D-E-R, night writer, like hit the car. She also wants to know, have you ever based a character on a real person, and if so, do they know it? So my answer to all of these, first of all, when I'm not writing, I'm teaching. When I'm not teaching, if you're meaning like what do I do in my downtime, hang out with my family. We watch some movies, we watch some TV, I play some video games here and there, but I'm a homebody. I like to stay at home. Occasionally I fix broken toilets, or occasionally I call people to help me fix broken toilets, and just that kind of stuff. So I am absolutely a day writer. I've tried writing at night. It does not go well. I have based a character. Well, I've based a character. I've named a character after a real person. You can say it that way. Though the character and the real person are different. Some similarities between physical descriptions and obviously the name and all those types of things, but beyond that, the character is the character, and I do that for a few reasons. First of all, I'm always afraid of the backlash. I would never do that, said the person Aaron was basing his character on, and sometimes the characters have to be their own characters, and I feel like basing them on real people, you can base elements of characters on real people that you know, but I kind of do the conglomeration aspect where I'll take pieces of different people I know and roll them into one particular character, kind of the Frankenstein theory, I suppose, and that's how I had it. So that's my answer there. How about you, Pops?
Yeah, this is a quadruple decker question, but that's fine. That's fine. They're all very easy to answer with that. Now, just before I get into that, you said she is a fellow
LPC, Lighthouse Publishing of the Carolinas, and Brimstone.
Which is?
My publisher?
Yeah, it's part of the overall publisher.
They're an imprint.
I got you. Okay, that makes sense. All right, I see where you're going. Brimstone is an imprint of LPC. That's what you're looking for.
Remember, I just don't like to assume everybody knows what the initials mean and stuff. So
that's true. Yes.
That's just me trying to get that information out for all the people out there who will now want to send me checks for making that clear. Okay, there's quadruple decker question here. What do I do when I'm not writing? I'm probably working on an old typewriter. This has become a new what's the right word, addiction that I have. I fix them, I clean them up, I try to make sure that they can type, even though I probably wouldn't do a lot of typing on some of them. They're just too old. When you're used to a computer cranking out something on a 1915 typewriter, might be even too slow to do. But with that, I give this quick announcement. My most recent edition is a 1953 Smith Corona Sterling, which I bought for $15. Of course, it was busted. It's not busted now. I fixed it and it works. And one of the reasons I like it so much is that's the year I was born. So sometimes the typewriters have a connection to something, and I tie them. I make notes on whether or not they were used. Not the particular typewriter. That model was used by some famous author. So the other thing I do when I'm not writing is I watch lots and lots of documentaries. I am a docu-nerd. I love documentaries. I'd rather watch that more than just about any other program on television because I'm a hankering for information all the time. I'm usually a daytime writer because I'm not my best at night. I'm usually my best when I first get up after 5 or 6 cups of coffee, and then I'm ready to go. I have written well into the night, but that's usually an unusual occurrence, and it's because I'm right at the end of something or right up against a deadline. No, I've never based a character on a real person, though someone accused me of that. I remember they had read my book, and I said, "Oh, I know who you based this person on." No, I didn't. The closest I've come to anything like that is there was an actor, and I used his physical description as a description for one of my characters, but I don't even do that very much. And part of the reason is when you start basing them on real-life people, you start making their actions what that real-life person would do. And you don't want that. You want your characters to do what they would do. So I don't like to tie them to any particular person at all. And what was the last one? Oh, and the fourth question answer is that it's already been answered in question number 3. So since I don't base anything on a real person, no, they don't know that.
Or maybe you have and they don't know that.
Maybe.
You're just saying that you've never done it.
Maybe. Yeah, and even if you do, I wouldn't go around telling people because that's the stuff of lawsuits.
Agreed. Pops, do you ever watch What on Earth?
Yes.
I've gotten into that show as well.
That's a great show. What on Earth is, for those that haven't seen it, is it's a program about satellite photos. And since we have, I forget how many thousand satellites, 1,200 satellites or something in space, a lot of them are photo-based, and they take some pretty interesting pictures at times. And some of them are just real mysteries as to why those things are there. And so it's a lot of fun. It's a good program. Yeah.
How about you, Molly? What are your answers to your 4 questions?
Well, first of all, during the day, I have a day job, so that keeps me busy. But by choice, when I'm not writing, I am an odd duck. I like to clean my house, spend time in the kitchen, and spend time with my friends. I do watch a lot of TV. Most of the time, I'm also doing something else, multitasking. A lot of people will say that TV is a time waster, but I actually find that it kind of it inspires me, my creativity. It's got the great characters and the plots, and just kind of lets my mind relax and appreciate other people's creativity as well. I'm a right-in-the-moment kind of writer, so I can write day or night. Most of the time, because of my schedule, I do end up writing later at night. I've been known to not start writing until 9 or almost 9:30 at night and then go until 1 or 2 in the morning, which is not something that I like to do, but again, because of the schedule, that's what I do. A lot of times during the day, I'll write a little sticky notes to myself if I get little ideas, quotes, character ideas, and then I just kind of collate them and the rest in the evening. And then I write and edit on my lunch hour. And no, I have never based a character on a real person, with the exception of there was one character in my current work and project that has characteristics similar to an old boyfriend. And yes, he does know that he's similar to it, but I did not base the character on him.
Fair enough. Excellent.
Here, I thought the romantic lead was based on me.
Uh, yeah, no.
Things were not awkward enough, Pop. So
I'm
I
just
just
gonna
really.
go now and
Well, we are talking about conflict this month, and glancing over our topics, we're taking kind of an unconventional approach to conflict. And usually, when people talk about this, they'll kind of do a brief overview of how to do it and maybe how to keep conflict alive or up the stakes they'll talk about. But we're looking at some very specific aspects of conflict and how to deepen the conflict and expand the conflict. But before we can do that, we really want to define what conflict is and what it means. And so conflict, simply put, is the object or the obstacle, be it a person, event, some sort of danger that stands between your character and their desires. So we've talked about characters last week. They always want something. Something has to stand in their way. That's the conflict. Now there are two types, and I'm just going to kind of cover this briefly so that we can move on to our topic tonight, which is balancing thought and action. But an external conflict is probably the most common that you're going to see. Most popular novels use some sort of external conflict, which could be man versus man, which is one person versus another. A boxing match, or somebody's trying to take over the world. You get something like Man versus Society, which might be a legal thriller. Man versus Technology, iRobot, kind of the Skynet, the uprising of technology. Man versus God, or other supernatural forces. Greek and Roman mythology, you'll see that a lot. Man versus Nature, something like the perfect storm. And so those are the external ones. To contrast those, we do have the internal conflict, which is commonly just called man versus self, or man versus himself, if we want to take it that way. And this can usually break down into something like the overcoming somebody's past, or overcoming somebody's fears. You'll see these coupled together, the internal and external conflict. Good novels will wrap these both together. Literary short stories are usually more internal struggles. People dealing with grief and loss and guilt and regret and all those types of things. But you see it a lot in popular fiction as well. And again, I'm not trying to say that one is better than the other, just that seems to be kind of a line that I've seen between the two. Pops, you have mentioned several examples of the different types of conflict here, and you've added to my list, and I'm not sure how I feel about that, my list of external conflicts. So why don't you tell our
Sounds like you
listeners?
two have a conflict going on. Did you
Indeed,
plan
we
this?
do. It's man versus man, mono v mono. So we'll put up our dukes. Pops, what did you add to the list, and what are some examples that you compiled? Because you had some good examples here.
Well, yeah, I added some examples to your list, and then wanted to throw in a few more to kind of flesh things out. One of the ones I added was man versus supernatural evil, like in The Exorcist or some of the others. And many of my novels were supernatural suspense, so I felt like that was a genre that we needed to put in there, because it's a man against some force greater than himself. And by man, of course, we're being generic. It's sometimes a woman against a greater force that has supernatural abilities or whatever it might be. And that's a serious conflict. How do you overcome something like that? I also added man versus corporation or organization. Sometimes the most frightening thing in the world is not an individual, but a corporation. So The Firm was about a legal thriller, and it was a company that was really the problem. Of course, there are people in that. Sooner or later, you're going to have to narrow it down to an individual, but sometimes it's the corporation that creates the problem. Or one of the books that Robin Cook, sorry. Mm. Always call his novels cookbooks, Robin Cook. His first book, Coma, was great about that, because it was a big pharmaceutical corporation that his protagonist had to overcome. And then also Man versus the Unknown, and I mentioned your book, The Hand of Adonai. Your crew, your cast, find themselves in a situation they can't fully understand, and even though, based on the premise, they're supposed to know everything that is available and that goes on, things are not what they expect, and so that puts them into the unknown. They're out of their depth or out of their worldvieue, and so they're having to fight whatever this unknown is as you work your way through the book, and of course that becomes revealed a little bit later. And then on the internal, I added my book Wounds for overcoming the past, because my primary protagonist has a past that haunts him, that hamstrings him in everything he does his entire life. And then also the facing or overcoming fears, what kind of life you're going to have. And for some reason, the curious case of Benjamin Button, who's aging backwards, came to mind, because that's really the big problem, is how he's going to fit into a society that he can't possibly fit into. So there's some fears and about himself and what he's going to face.
Absolutely, and that's almost a fear of the future. He doesn't understand what's going on with him, and so he fears for his future. And it's interesting in the fact that most of us look forward to death. And that sounds odd to say.
Yeah.
we don't have a definite time ascribed to us. We don't know the exact day or time that we're going to die. But as he's aging backward, it becomes very, very clear to him as he becomes less competent, and that's one of the main thrusts of the movie and the story as well, of losing his competence. And yeah, there's a lot that we can talk about. We'll have to talk about that one.
But you do bring up something that's really good, because you're talking about the Benjamin Button could also fit in another category, and that's often the way it is in novels. It's not just man versus man or man versus society. You can have more than one thing going on. So in my book Wounds, I have a man who must overcome his past. That's one problem. But he also has to overcome a serial killer, and he also has to overcome somebody he's working with. So there's really several things that are going on in that. There'll be one primary storyline in that, one primary conflict that your character will have to deal with, but there's usually more than one, and they're kind of linked together, and that makes for a more interesting book. So I guess the warning is, don't just choose one and try to stick religiously to that. Understand that you can have several of these. So a man versus technology, it could also be versus society at the same time.
You could even do a man versus technology and man versus the supernatural, where the technology becomes possessed by a demon or something crazy like that. Like, there are several different things that you can do, and I think what you'll find is, like characters, as you add characters to your novels, the page count increases. As you add conflict to your novel, the page count increases, and so you'll see that smaller books tend to have a more focused approach in their conflict. There will usually be fewer conflicts at play. Not that they're in any way less than other novels, but just fewer of them on the pages, fewer questions that are asked, fewer obstacles to overcome. Whereas the long ones, you're going to have multiple characters, and each of these characters is dealing with themselves in some way. They all have some sort of history or past that they're dealing with and trying to overcome, and you get your character arcs from that. But at the same time, you're trying to save the world. In The Hand of Adonai, Oliver is dealing with the sense of guilt. He feels guilty. He feels as if he's to blame for his friends waking up in this violent, terrifying video game. And so the same rate that he's trying to save them, he's also trying to, come to grips with the fact that these evils that they're facing, a lot of them came from his imagination, and so he feels largely responsible for that. So you'll get stuff like that. Lauren, the other protagonist, has self-esteem issues, and she's got to learn to trust people. She's got some trust issues, and there's a lot of stuff kind of going on with her in her internal struggles, at the same time as she's lighting monsters on fire and trying to protect herself and her friends. So layering those conflicts is really the key to I think a successful novel, a fun novel, an interesting one, a real page turner, especially as you weave them together. And that's one thing that we should probably talk about, is how you weave these particular conflicts together, because that could be quite the challenge.
Before we do, let me throw one thing out here. I find asking particular questions for every project helps me out a great deal. One of the questions I ask when I'm considering a novel is this: what happens if my protagonist fails? What bad happens if the protagonist fails? So if you're writing a romance, the marriage falls apart, or they They don't get together. If you're writing a Western, the sheep herders take over cow land, whatever it might be. If you ask that question, what happens if my primary protagonist fails, you will then identify what your area of conflict is. That'll be the key conflict. You'll have other things come in, but that'll help you understand what your character must achieve for him or her to be successful.
That's a really good point. I think of the Lord of the Rings, specifically the first one, the Fellowship of the Rings, where Frodo has that vision of what the Shire is, what's going to happen to the Shire if he doesn't get rid of this ring, if he doesn't destroy it, and all the hobbits are enslaved and there's suffering and pain and all that. There's your conflict. If you don't get rid of the ring, then everybody that you know and love is going to be, forced into slavery and death and all sorts of abominable things. And that will be good for identifying, like you say, that primary conflict. But there can be, and there should be, I think, secondary conflicts,
Sure.
tertiary conflicts. Be aware you don't want to put too much in there, otherwise you're going to have an 800-page book. If you're Stephen King or George R.R. Martin, that's totally acceptable. But for some of us, down here on the bottom end of the food chain, whatever it is, we don't get to write 800-page books. Our publishers tell us how many pages we get. So be aware of that. And also, in the editing process, if you notice you have too many pages, is there a conflict that you can take out? Is there one that you started that just didn't really develop? Something to consider. Now, with these two conflicts, external versus internal is what we're talking about tonight. There are really two different approaches for developing them. External conflict is really developed through through action, the showing, not telling. The reader can see and experience what's happening. Whereas internal conflict more often plays out in thought, which we call interior monologue. And so that's the thinking game, right? And so your characters should think and they should act. I've read several books where characters do one or the other, but they do very little of one and a whole lot of the other. I tend to come back to the Hunger Games as my example here. And I enjoyed Hunger Games. I thought it was actually a pretty well done book. But I did find, and this is interesting, we might be able to talk a little bit about this, I found there to be too much interior monologue in the book. There was a lot of Peeta, Gale, and at some point I was like, just shoot something with an arrow. I just want to watch something bleed. But I will talk to female readers, and they're like, no, it wasn't too much. That was perfect. That was just right. And of course you would be thinking that, and all these types of things. And I'm like, just stab something. I like blow something up. And things did blow up, and people did get stabbed and shot with arrows, so I was happy. But I thought it was a little bit heavy on the interior monologue side. Now, I'm going to contrast that with some other books, which I won't name, that I thought were just almost entirely thought and almost no action at all. And that was really frustrating to me because I found it somewhat boring. And so really what we want to talk about tonight is finding that balance between the two, using particular tools to develop the conflict as that plays out. Pops, did you have anything before we move on to the tools?
Yeah, I think that what we want to make sure is that everyone keep a couple things in mind, and that is to understand what you're doing with a novel. You are leading the reader through an experience. Nonfiction is education, but fiction is experience. It's something that and it's why people read fiction, is they want to experience something they don't experience in their own life. And that requires that there be action. You have to have somebody you care about doing something, but also they need to be human. They're not robots. So as they do this, they're going to experience the whole gamut of emotions, most likely. So you have to be able to do that too, without it becoming too lopsided or too distracting. I've had books like that. I was once asked to endorse a book which I couldn't endorse, and the line that probably just finished it for me was, and this was a woman who was highly trained professional dealing with someone else she'd had a relationship with who's also highly trained and professional, and she has this thought, why doesn't he ask me about the child he doesn't know he has? And at that point I thought, well, okay, we're done. Because he doesn't know he has the child, and that's why he's not asking. But they wanted so much to put some kind of sensitive emotion in there, make us feel sorry for her, it got ridiculous. So it takes balance to make them work. So if you're just all action, and once again, I was asked to look at a book, and I think there were 5 gunfights in the first 10 pages, and different gunfights I'm talking about now. It made no sense whatsoever. But the guy wanted to write action and thriller stuff. Well, that's not the way to start off to do that. So he was completely unbalanced on that. Not the writer was unbalanced. The story was unbalanced on that.
Good clarification.
I don't know. Maybe the writer was unbalanced. I think we all are a little unbalanced.
Well, we are talking conflict tonight, so.
That's true. Rather than allowing the reader to be taken on this journey and experience these things through the protagonist. That's what I'm getting at.
Well said. And I'll go back to the Hunger Games here, and what, you've got a bunch of kids killing each other, which is a pretty horrifying thing. And the interior monologue that you get, other than just Peta and Gale, is, should I be doing this? Like, I have to protect myself, but at the same time, it seems weird to kill my peers and to kill these other younger people. And so there's that conflict there. And I use that specifically because I find that when people are too heavy on the action side, they end up having people like just, the army all-star who just mows down everyone, all the enemies, just kills them all and runs through the enemy lines, and they're victorious. And that, but war is something else. And the types of people who can just wholesale kill an entire opposing army without having any sort of emotional connection, those are psychopaths. Those are not people that I relate to. Those are not people, like, at some point, give me a line of dialogue. I wish I didn't have to kill you. Some of the most powerful wartime scenes are people who kill even though they don't want to, or the ones who choose not to kill. I think of Saving Private Ryan, and I think it was that movie where the enemies come face to face, and one stabs the other, and the other one starts to kind of like scream and panics. His eyes get real big, and the other guy that's stabbing him is going, shh, shh, it's okay, and it's like, that is weird, because there's the action, obviously, but then that the action tells us the internal feeling as well. In context of story and book, if you want a really good example of this, I encourage you to read The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien, in which he has an entire short story with one man standing with another, and this guy had just killed the first in war. He'd killed a Vietnam soldier, and he's just standing looking at the body, and the whole thing, all he does is describe the body, and then there's a friend next to him saying, "Come on, let's go. You did what you have to do. It's okay." And just that constant prodding, and description of the man, prodding, description of the man, prodding, description of the man, prodding. And it's the way I'm describing it makes it sound redundant, but it's really not. It's incredibly powerful and moving because you get that interior monologue. And even though it is really heavy on the interior monologue, it's just a short story. It's just a few pages. If he tried to continue that out for an entire novel, it would probably be too much. But he's found that balance, and for him, the balance is not the killing, but the impact on the person who's done the killing, and how he imagines. The action that you get is him imagining the life that has been taken from this soldier, this enemy soldier. He imagines a wife for this soldier. He imagines a child for this soldier. And that's where you see the action, which is technically still interior monologue because it's his own imagination. It's not real. But that story demanded a heavier balance of thought than it did with action. Again, I think commercial fiction is really geared more toward action, and so I think you want to kind of stay in that realm if you're looking to push books. But the more literary side, you've got to have that interior monologue as well to kind of balance it out. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think what you're saying here, and I agree 100% with this, is that the action and the thought, dealing with the conflict, go hand in hand. One leads to the other. So action will lead to thought, thought will lead to action. Now, I did the same thing with the soldiers when I was working with Major Struker, and one of the main characters is the sniper for this Army Special Forces team, and he's very good at what he does, and he has to shoot people. They don't know he's there, so they don't know their death is coming. There's not a real confrontation. He just has to pull the trigger on a few people. But that always bothered me. I started being bothered if I didn't show some emotion in that, and so I wrote in how much it bothered him. Not that he would hesitate. He has to do it to save his team, but at the same time, it doesn't mean he has to like it. Wake up in the morning and go, man, I can't wait to go shoot someone in the head today. It bothers him. And so it's the price of his action. And then we see that in some of his thoughts. And then at times we see his thoughts first and then the action he has to take with that. So the two go together, one leads to the other.
American Sniper comes to mind, the book and the movie, and the fact that the choices that he had to make and the choices the enemy, if we want to call him that, put him in. It's awful. Where he's looking down his scope at a child or a woman, and he's thinking, don't pick up that bomb, don't pick up that bomb, don't pick up that bomb.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just excruciating for us to be inside his mind at that time, because we know that weight for him. And I've known people who've gone to war and are bona fide war heroes, and I've asked them some questions about it, and they, I'd rather not talk about it. And you get that a lot.
Absolutely.
Is it
some things they won't talk about?
Is it Steinbeck who wrote Why the Soldiers Won't Talk? Great little piece.
I don't remember, but that is certainly true. And they had that problem after World War I, which was such a horrendous war. Really, after every war, you get to see some of that. I think a good balance, if you want to do the television version of this, is watch MASH, which has a lot of comedy, but they never leave out the emotion or the price that people pay, and they make all the people look human instead of machines. And so, getting in conflict. As we talk about the conflict, getting both the action but also the thought process. And by thought, we're also referring to the emotion and the stuff that goes on inside.
Star Trek: The Next Generation. We'll stick on the television theme. I'm thinking of an interesting take on, I guess you say it's almost a Pinocchio tale of Data wanting to be human, and his conflict is that he's not human and that he doesn't have emotion. And that's something that, it's strange to say that he has no emotion, but he still wants to be human, which would be an emotion, but a little bit of a paradox there. But that's really the only thing that he has, the only emotion that he has for most of the series is a desire to be more human. And so that's his interior struggle is not. But you do still get some moments where he's very humanized. It's hard for us to relate to machines, but it's a lot easier for us to relate to a machine who wants something and can't have it. So, yeah. I was going to say something else about war. And
well, that reminds me of a Twilight Zone episode that had Leonard Nimoy, who went on to be in Star Trek, the classic version, the original. Mm-hmm. And he plays a soldier that has a group of Japanese soldiers trapped in a cave. And he wants to go after them. He wants to kill them. He wants to burn them out, real gung-ho. And then for a short period of time, he's forced to exchange places with them. And now he's in the cave. And he experiences and has the realization that these are people. Not just the enemy, but they're also people. And that he was becoming less of a person, while these people, as you said, had families and things like that. So, and that shows then the complexity of war. The conflict within the conflict.
Yeah. Again, the Things They Carried is a great example of that if you get an opportunity to read it. I did want to mention one thing quickly about the balance of thought versus action. When I say that, please don't think that it means 50% one, 50% the other. I don't want you going through and counting words and paragraphs and sentences. Instead,
oh, good, because I was just about ready to do that, and I was going to throw something at you.
Well, I was worried about you, Molly, and that's why I decided to clarify. But
Well,
um,
you're always worried about me, but today it would be for this issue.
there you go. If we go back to that story of the things they carried, where the man is standing over the victim of his the enemy that he's killed, um, the balance of that story is probably 90-10. It's about 90% thought, 10% action. And for again that short story, that's what it needs. Other short stories are probably 90%. Any teleplay really is going to be almost 100% action and very little thought, unless you've got some sort of voiceover narration going. They've got to show the interior monologue in different ways. That usually comes out in dialogue and action. But um, you want to find the balance for your particular work. And so you might be at 70-30. You might be at 75-25. If you're at 90-10 for an entire novel, that might be too much. You might want to change that up. But it's a scale. When I say balance, I don't mean perfectly even. I mean you just want to make sure that you've got some of each, and that one is not completely overtaking it. A good exercise that Jerome Stern talks about in Making Shapely Fiction, he's got a section in there called juggling, and he describes that as the movement between dialogue and action, or between thought and action. And he talks about how that particular switching between the two can really heighten tension. For example, if you've got somebody who's juggling hatchets in a circus, and it's a very dangerous act to juggle hatchets or axes, that's where I was going with that. But they're
Okay,
thinking
sure.
about their mortgage payment that they can't pay, or they're thinking about their ailing grandfather, or they're thinking about something else. Well, now you spend a paragraph putting the axes in the air, you spend another paragraph or two talking about what she's thinking about, and we're, as readers, very nervous about those axes that are suspended in midair now, because they're coming down. We know that, but we just don't know when. The problem is if you let them hang up there for 2 or 3 pages, we forget that they're there. And so you've got to make sure that they're coming back down. And so moving between thought and action can be a very powerful way to really increase the tension of your story. Does that make sense?
It does.
Yes.
So tools that you can use to develop external conflict, and I want to talk about that one first because I think it's really, for me, that's the one that's really driving fiction is action. And really there are two that I can think of, and it's dialogue and it's action. And that's, dialogue is going to move things forward. For example, you've got somebody say, take one more step, Sam, and I'll blow your head clean off. Okay, that's some external action there, right? You were with her again, weren't you? Okay, so if we want it to be more of a personal thing, or if we're looking at man versus technology, I can't let you do that, Dave.
I'm
Did I get that
sorry,
quote right?
Dave.
I'm
That's a
sorry,
little
Dave.
creepy, guys.
Yeah.
That's
Um,
from
Well, I know what
um,
it's from, but it's just that you have the
2001.
whole voice down, so it's
to be fair, my impersonation is an impersonation of my dad's impersonation because I've never seen the film.
oh, okay.
I'm sorry, Dave. I can't do that.
Yeah.
It's just really spooky the way he did that. As I'm looking at this list that you've just given us here, in a sense, dialogue also reveals thought. So I'm a little concerned that if we hit this too hard, that people are going to think, it's either action or it is thought. You're telling story. You're just emphasizing or choosing a way to tell that story that's memorable to the reader. So when you take one more step, Sam, and I'll blow your head clean off, no one has to tell us what the gunman is thinking. Right? We know
Right.
he's upset because just the dialogue alone reveals what's already going on in his head. So you don't have to put that in. And then sometimes the action tells us what the thought is. And I'm thinking about your book where you have Bailey and her mom at the police station, and the investigating officer is asking questions, and mom is opening her purse. It's got the little latch on it, and she flicks it open, she closes it, she flicks it open, she closes it, she flicks it open and closes it. You don't tell us she's upset. You don't tell us she's worried. You don't tell us that she's stressed out about this. But her action tells us the thought, what's going on in her mind. So sometimes the dialogue or the action it's a physical action, will reveal the interior emotions that the character is feeling.
What book was that again? Because that just sounds like a genius technique.
Well, yeah, it was, and the author came by it genetically, I think. The gifts. It's the hand of Adonai.
Yeah. And I'm actually glad that you picked up on that because that's exactly what I was trying to do. And I remember sitting at my desk thinking, okay, what does this look like? How do I show that she's upset and nervous without actually
That's
saying it?
textbook.
Yeah.
It's textbook.
So and that's I mean it's not that thought didn't originate with me. That was obviously something that I've learned from other fantastic writers. Genetically, I think I came by it. But like you say, dialogue does reveal interior thought. But what we can do though is use thought to twist what's going on, right? Take one more step, Sam, and I'll blow your head clean off, Billy said. Then we have a thought, Billy thinking, please don't take another step. I really can't do this. Whatever the case may be, where we show that Billy's nervous. Or we can do that through action, right? Billy leveled the gun at Sam's chest. We want to show now that he's nervous, so we add something else. The barrel of his weapon wandered from side to side as his hand shook. Okay, so now we're getting here a little more tension and uncertainty from Sam without having to use any dialogue. And Pops, that's a suggestion that you made, an example that you gave here. I want to give you credit for that as well.
It's amazing how much can be said and how much information can be conveyed in just a single line like that without force-feeding the reader, which is the mistake that new writers make. They want to force-feed the reader. Instead, you just lead them along. They will see what needs to be seen. You paint the picture, they'll look at it.
Absolutely. We can continue on. He'd not felt a cold this deep in his life, had never imagined being cold to his core. His muscles turned to ice and refused to move. Camp was miles away still, and he couldn't still his hands long enough to strike a match. So we've got some description there, some action of him moving, trying to get to camp, trying to build a fire. I haven't taken that directly from To Build a Fire by Jack London, but it's the concept comes from that story, which is a lot of action of him walking, but it's also a lot of thought. And he balances that out nicely. The thought in that particular story comes not only from the man, but also from the dog, where the dog is thinking, what an idiot this guy is, like, truthfully, like, the dude is a jerk to the dog, and the dog is kind of like, yeah, you're really dumb. It's a lot of fun. If we want to continue like a man versus society kind of theme, the action might look like this. The lawyer spread out his notes for the case. By the look of it, he'd slaughtered an entire forest to get the notes that he needed. Just the overwhelming papers there. And that's action and description building that tension for us without having to use dialogue, without having to tell. We don't want to say, the lawyer was well prepared. We want to give those physical descriptions to show that.
Yeah, and you've done something interesting here. In your illustrations, you've used first person and third person, and that's a good thing to talk about. First person is great for showing the thinking of the individual, because it's not a narrator saying this is what the person felt. It's the person either indicating it by action or thinking it. Now, true internal dialogue is usually done in italics, and that's where the internal dialogue is a statement without quotation marks, because it's not said aloud. And please don't write, I need to get going right now, he thought to himself. But who else would he think to? Okay. If you have to say he thought, sometimes you have to do that, but if you put in italics and it's clearly internal dialogue, that's going on with that. In third person, the narrator is bringing some of these things to the attention of the reader. So he had not felt a cold this deep. It's not first person. He's not saying, I have never felt cold this deep. We're being told that. And then we're also being told with some of the action that he couldn't light a match. It was so cold. Same thing with the lawyer spreading out the notes for the case. And then if you want to indicate what's going on in his mind without saying it, once he lays the notes out, if he wipes the perspiration off the palm of his hands, then we know that maybe he's a little tense about this.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you mentioned that. The difference between first and third is pretty significant. I find that the balance of interior monologue versus dialogue and action tends to shift more toward the interior when you're writing in first person. That's where you might get like a 70-30 split towards the interior monologue versus the action. Third person, you might be 70 action, 30 interior monologue. What's important to note that is in neither point of view, or in no point of view, should you ever be at 90 and 10 and 100 and 0. You have to mix them both. Again, find that right balance, and a lot of that is determined by point of view. I didn't have that in the show notes, but I definitely should have. Very good observation, Pops.
Yeah, the key is to think of it as a meal. Most meals are not just one thing. It's just not all chicken legs. You know, there may be mashed
It's
potatoes, there
not
may
all
be
just
vegetables.
popcorn.
It's not all just popcorn. There's variation. There's different things on the plate. And a good novel has that. It has several things going on at one time, because that makes it more interesting, just like a plate of varied food is usually tastier.
Hmm. Absolutely. I was going to tell the story of when I first married Naomi, and I decided to spoil her and cook her dinner. Have I told you the story? She says, "What are we going to have?" And I said, "Steak." And she goes, "And what else?" And I said, "Soda, the drink,
Oh.
steak sauce."
Water,
What are you
salt.
looking for here? I don't feel like I have the right answer for you. Why are you looking at me like that? No potatoes or vegetable? What? No. Why? No. Steak. Steak is for dinner, and then more steak. So
A1 sauce. That's the
that's it. Yeah.
that's the gravy right there.
And then dessert. So that's how I do dinner. But um, my wife is a much better cook than am I. So anyhow, moving on. Now, interior conflict plays out through interior monologue. I've got a couple of examples here that I put together, and I notice now that they're both in first person. As much as I loved her, I couldn't be with her. I wouldn't put her through that kind of misery. Or if I tell her about Sally, she'll never forgive me. Now, you can easily change these to third person, right? As much as he loved her, he couldn't be with her. He wouldn't put her through that kind of misery. Look, I just changed the pronouns, and now it's in third person. So it can still be consistent. You can do it in either. Again, it's just a matter of how much time you're going to spend in thought. The best books make use of both types of conflict. So again, I don't want you counting sentences, but you may want to go through and take a few pages. This might be a good exercise for you. And just grab a couple different colored highlighters and go through 5 to 10 pages. And everything that's action, maybe you highlight in blue, and everything that's thought, you highlight in pink. And just look at the rough breakdown so you can visually see how you're doing it, seeing if you're too heavy on one side or the other. That might give you a good way to find a more natural balance. Excuse me. There's that. Pops, anything else on that note?
Well, you've got some good observations there, and I don't think first person is superior to third, and I don't think third is superior to first. I use first, one, because I find it a lot easier. I've just tuned into that. But most of my books are third person. Third person allows you to show action, interior thinking in other characters, not in the same scene. Don't jump points of view. But in another chapter, you could even be in the antagonist's mind and see what a sicko he is or she is. Which you can't do in first person. So they both have their advantages, but in both, at some point, you're going to look into somebody's brain, to the emotional stew that is them, and reveal bits and pieces of that. And in first person, it'll be the character doing the revealing. If you're doing third person, even third person close, it's going to be the narrator who is doing the revealing.
Absolutely. So a couple reasons you may want to use interior monologue. You might want to show doubt. You might want to demonstrate, show some sort of dichotomy or juxtapose what's being said or done versus what's being thought. To show infatuation or guilt or fear, really to kind of show these emotions. You might want to use interior monologue for that, at least a little bit. Reasons for using action, it's more exciting to the reader, easier to raise the stakes, and it really makes for more memorable scenes. Very rarely does somebody read a book and say, "Oh, remember that one thing the character thought?" We remember what the characters do and what the characters say, not necessarily just what they think. That doesn't mean that we don't pay attention to what they think. It's just not what leaves that lasting impression on us. So, final comments, Pops?
I was just thinking in my book Wounds, the bad guy, we get an insight into how his twisted brain works when he's washing his face and he's hearing voices come out of the faucet. Okay, but there's no one there to hear that but him, so it's all interior. So all that action other than, and that's what I'm doing with that, is I'm blending physical action with mental action. The real story is in the mental action, the emotional action, but there's a physical action that's driving it. So he's washing his face, but he's hearing voices come out of the faucet, and that tells the reader this guy is maybe a sandwich or two shy of a full picnic. There's something missing there. His elevator doesn't go to the top, or what are the other sayings that people have, that he just ain't right. And that's what makes him more frightening, in that the more unbalanced we see him, the more sympathy we feel for the protagonist, because we know at some point the paths are going to cross.
Indeed. Well said. Molly, do we have any questions, comments, concerns from the room tonight?
Tess was in the room tonight. There wasn't anybody else chatting that I noticed. Norma Gale had checked in yesterday, said she would have loved to have joined us, but she was unable to. And Tess made dinner and shared it with us, figuratively, of course. Spaghetti meatballs and kale spinach walnut salad, so she made me hungry. Talking about food earlier. She did throw out a couple of quotes, one by Stephen Moyer. Conflict is drama, and how people deal with conflict shows you the kind of people they are. Nicolas Cage said, I think what makes people fascinating is conflict. It's drama. It's the human condition. Nobody wants to watch perfection.
Well, that's not what my wife told me when she married me.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what Naomi told you.
Heavy sigh.
All right,
Yeah.
all right.
Shaking my head.
SMH.
There's so much internal conflict going on right now.
Oh my goodness. Well.
There's a little bit of nausea too, so that's sort of internal conflict.
Yeah.
And I'm feeling a lot of external conflict right now, man versus man, and man versus woman, and man versus producer, and man versus co-host, and
yeah. Well,
it's not getting a lot of love here.
These are our big challenges, man versus internet.
Oh my goodness.
Man versus bandwidth.
Technology versus technology. So, well, next week we are going to be looking at figurative language and how figurative language, how you can use that to heighten your conflict. Again, I tell you, it's a little different than what you're going to get in most podcasts. So, don't forget to ask the author. Thank you, Jessica Bailey Anderson, for offering your question tonight, and you can do that either by sending us an email to firstsinfictionpodcast@gmail.com. Remember
good
that
catch.
time.
All right.
Or you can tweet at us or Facebook us, and we'll make sure to add that to our list. And you can always find us at aarongansky.com, altongansky.com, and frankly, mydearmojo.com. I did speak to Heather Luby this week, and her life is super busy, especially Tuesday nights, which is unfortunate for us. So it may be a while before we can have her on. We might bring her on halfway through a cast one night, just a surprise guest. But we are thinking of her, and we miss her, and appreciate all she's done for the podcast. So, and speaking of people we appreciate you taking your time to listen to us. So we thank you all for listening. And until next week, good writing.